This is Keeping the Faith on the Mormon Faircast. The Keeping the Faith series explores ways in which our faith can be challenged and ways in which we can overcome those challenges. In this episode, I interviewed Joseph Smith scholar Don Bradley, who shares his story about how and why he left the church and what brought him back. Don Bradley, welcome to the Mormon Faircast.
Thanks.
Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself? What are you involved in now?
Professionally, I'm a writer and editor. Right now, I am completing a master's degree in history at Utah State, where I'm working with Philip Barlow. My thesis is about what we can know of what was in the lost 116 pages of the Book of Mormon.
And then there'll be a book that's going to be coming out.
Yeah, I've got that with Greg Kofod Books. It should be out sometime in 2013. And the first section of the book will deal with what we can know about the history of the lost 116 pages. So the background, the translation process that was used, who the scribes were, how did Martin Harris end up taking the manuscript in the first place, and then what we may be able to know about the theft, what the evidence is about the theft. And then the second section is really more of what the thesis is about, and that is the history in the lost 116 pages. So what can we learn both from the internal evidence of the text and external sources like 19th century interviews and speeches and so on about the history of the Nephites that was narrated in the lost pages.
Now, there are people who are going to be saying, well, how are you going to talk about the internal evidence of the text when the text is lost? Yeah.
So I meant the internal evidence of the extant text, the text that we still have available.
Right. So what the Book of Mormon tells us about what may be in that 116 pages.
Right. So we've got a few different kinds of evidence there. One is that the small plates cover the exact same time period as the lost portion. And so the small plates, if we read carefully in the small plates text, we can see the hints of what may have been further developed in the lost pages. We also have in Mormon's subsequent abridgment, so from the Book of Mosiah forward, occasionally we have sort of flashbacks to the lost pages period. So for instance, in Mosiah chapter 11, there's a place where it mentions the hill which was north of the land Shiloh, and it says that this hill had been a refuge for the children of Nephi at the time they fled out of the land. Well, that's a narrative that is not detailed in our extant text, but we're given a little snippet of it there. It's referring back to something that would have been in the lost pages. And then the Book of Mormon narratives sometimes follow sort of broader typological patterns. And so sometimes maybe where we have a portion of a narrative that fits a pattern, we can infer with some probability that the rest of the narrative probably evoked that same pattern. And then the external sources, we've got things like a report of an 1830 interview that was done with Joseph Smith Sr., where he narrated some of the missing material. We've got statements made by a few different apostles about little things. We've got, from the lost pages, we've also got a talk that Emer Harris, who's Martin Harris's brother, and a direct ancestor of Dallin Harris Oaks. We've got a speech that he gave at the Provo State Conference in 1856, where he gave a little additional information about Mulek that's not in our text.
Wow, that's fascinating. Now, you also gave a presentation at the Fair Conference on the Kinderhook plates.
Right.
And where did that research come from?
My good friend Mark Ashurst McGee, who's now with the Joseph Smith Papers, a number of years back, he gave a presentation at the Mormon History Association conference proposing that the Kinderhook plates Joseph Smith's reported translation of the Kinderhook plates was not a revelatory translation, but it was an attempt at secular translation. Joseph Smith was interested in languages, and this was one manifestation of that. He was trying to figure out what the characters meant. At the time, I was very intrigued with Mark's hypothesis, but I didn't see how it could be true because, for instance, he was looking for Hebrew characters or things that look like Hebrew characters on the Kinderhook plates. There were only a small handful, and they were scattered. There were like 3 of them, and they were scattered among 200 odd other characters. So there's no way that I could see to piece together, for Joseph Smith to have even thought he was piecing together something coherent from those plates. Subsequently, while I was doing some research of my own with the Kirtland Egyptian papers, I stumbled on something that would have provided a source where Joseph Smith could have gotten all of what William Clayton said in his journal that Joseph had translated from the Kinderhook plates. Joseph could have derived in a very easy way using that source. Then, as we'll talk about, I spent a while outside the church, completely out of the church. And during that time period, I found further evidence that Joseph Smith was, in fact, just doing a sort of secular translation, trying to figure out what was on those plates rather than having a revelation.
So when we read in somebody's journal, isn't it?
William Clayton, who was Joseph's private clerk at the time.
Yeah, he said that Joseph did a translation of the plates or something to that effect, or he put it in Joseph's words, didn't he?
Well, in the later history of the church, it's put in Joseph's words, but Clayton said President Joseph has translated a portion and says they contain the history of the person with whom they were buried, and that he was a descendant of Ham through the loins of Pharaoh, and that he received his kingdom from the ruler of heaven and earth. That's
okay,
the full
so what you did is you
he
took some of the characters on the Kinderhook plates and compared to some of the characters in the Kirtland Egyptian papers and found a match there.
Well, initially I wasn't comparing the characters. Initially, I was just reading there's a volume in the Kirtland Egyptian papers, the big one. It's titled The Grammar and Alphabet of the Egyptian Language. And I was just browsing in it because it's a fascinating document, and I was trying to figure out what in the world was going on with it, like so many other people are. And if you go just to the second page where they were attempting to match characters from the Egyptian papyri to definitions, there's a character that it's shaped like a boat, or kind of like if you take a D and you tilt it forward, so you've got the flat line on top and then the curve on the bottom. There's a character that has that shape, and they assigned it the name Hoi Upa, and the definition of the character includes all the elements that Clayton said Joseph had translated from the Kinderhook plates. So I don't remember the exact wording on this one, but it talks about a man who was a descendant of Pharaoh, that he was a king, and then it says something about him being a possessor of heaven and earth. So all of these ideas, descendant of Ham through the lines of Pharaoh is there, the idea of the man being a king, and then the idea of the language of the ruler or possessor of heaven and earth. Those are all there. Later, after I found that, I wondered, is there a character on the Kinderhook plates that has that shape? And so I looked, and I found that, in fact, one of the most prominent characters on all of the Kinderhook plates has that. It's right at the top of one of the plates. It's one of the largest characters. It has that same shape. And so Joseph could easily have, if he were doing even a sort of off-the-cuff comparison between the Kinderhook plates and the characters in the Grammar and Alphabet, he would have only needed to compare what's arguably the most prominent character on the Kinderhook plates with a character that appears on the second page of characters in the grammar and alphabet, and he would have found what appeared to be a match.
That's fascinating. And so the argument then is that if Joseph Smith did any translating of the Kinderhook plates at all, it was more a matter of trying to compare texts rather than going to Urim and Thummim or Seerstone and receiving revelation about it.
He did what he did was a very simple character match. That's all he did, and he didn't pursue it any further.
Yeah.
And so I really, while we don't know, I really suspect that it was a very off the cuff thing. I don't think it would have taken him more than 10 minutes to make that match.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and he didn't really spend all that much more time with them.
No, but once he found the match, he seemed to delight in showing people. There were some visitors who came to him, and he showed them the Kinderhook plates, and then he showed them, this is the other evidence, or one of the other pieces of evidence that I've got that I found while I was outside the church. And so I know some people will argue that this is like simply apologetics, but at the time that I found this other evidence, I was outside of the church. I believe at that point I was an atheist, and so I had no apologetic intentions whatsoever. But I found a newspaper article, the New York Herald, for, I can't remember, May 30th or something like that, 1843. And it contained a letter from someone, a non-Mormon in Nauvoo, and I think I know who that is. It was a doctor in Nauvoo, where this doctor says in the letter that he says, Joseph Smith compared in my presence the characters on these plates, the Kinderhook plates, with those on his Egyptian alphabet. That's what it says right there. Yeah. So it's like, we've got the smoking gun, so to speak, with the grammar and alphabet, and then we've got the eyewitness who saw him make the comparison.
That's fascinating. Well, so we'll link to those papers that you presented at the fair conference, and we'll provide a link to the book you're working on. And at the time we post this podcast, it won't be available for purchase, but when do you think the book will be ready to be purchased?
It will be available in 2013. The question is exactly when. I don't think it will be later than summer, and I'm hoping it will be out by the end of spring, but that would mean that that depends on me, and it depends also on the publisher. He would have to work really quickly to get it out by that point. So I would say probably summer.
Okay. Well, I'll look forward to seeing that. That'll be great. So we've talked a little bit about some of your experiences as a scholar in church history. Why don't you take us back to the beginning? Were you born in the church, or you convert? How long have you been a member?
I've been a member my whole life. My parents were both converts, and so I don't have like a deep history, pioneer history or anything like that in the church. We're originally from the East Coast. I was born in Baltimore, and my mom had been tracked out before I was born. We lived around the D.C. area for a while, and Baltimore area. Then we moved to South Bend, Indiana. I grew up a good part of my growing up was in the South Bend ward, which I have very fond memories of. It was like a real family.
So tell me about how you gained a testimony of the church. How old were you when you started to kind of formulate the concept that, this is, the Church of Jesus Christ?
I always, from as early as I can remember thinking about it, which is pretty early, I felt that the church was true. I hadn't had any dramatic experiences then, but I just had a sense that it was true. When I was a good kid, and I was fairly devout pretty early on. I remember at my baptism, our bishop, or after my baptism when I was going to receive the Holy Ghost, I was singing the hymn, my favorite, Choose the Right, so loudly that when the bishop announced that they were going to give the Holy Ghost to those who'd been baptized, he said, it looks like Brother Bradley already has it. So then, I started reading my scripture somewhat around 12 and really kind of exploring spiritually but also intellectually, just trying to figure out Book of Mormon geography and when the second coming was and so on. And in case you missed it, it was in the year 2000. That's what I had figured out it was going to be. But I really became very devout when I was about 15. It was partly a result of seminary. And I had some powerful spiritual experiences.
So, are you able to share any of those with us about, you said the seminary experiences that you've had? What can you tell us about that?
One experience that I'll mention is I had encountered, this will actually be two interlocked experiences. When I was about a junior or senior in high school, I started to encounter some Mormon fundamentalist literature, and they...
This is in Baltimore, Maryland?
No. Sorry. Okay. So we lived in South Bend until I was 13, and then we moved to Utah.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, my childhood kind of divides into thirds there. I spent my teenage years pretty much all in Utah, and when I was living in Utah Valley and then in Salt Lake for my senior year, and I had encountered fundamentalist literature just like at Sam Weller's bookstore and so on, and at the church archives. I started going to the church archives when I was 17 to do primary source research and also secondary.
Did you have any trouble getting access to documents as a 17-year-old?
One of my early, because I'd been reading fundamentalist stuff, one of my early projects, probably my earliest real history project, had to do with the Adam God theory and what might have been taught on it in the past. And so I had to have an interview. Everyone had to have an interview at that point to use the church archives. And the person who did those was Steve Sorensen. Usually it was about a 10-minute process where the person would tell Steve about what they were working on. He interviewed me for 2 hours, and then he gave me permission to use the documents. So,
wow, interesting. Is that still the process? Do you still have to have an interview to access certain documents?
From what I understand, you don't have to have an interview. You do need to tell them what subjects you're working on, because let's say that someone is working on temple endowment stuff. Well, they don't want people, like the history of the endowment or something, they don't want people working on sacred topics like that. And so they just want to know what people are working on. But almost any topic outside of something like that is something they would give permission for.
So how much access did you have to documents you wanted to see as a 17-year-old? Do you remember, was there ever an occasion where you're saying, hey, where's this document, and you weren't able to access it?
So I don't remember anything that I wasn't allowed to see. I'm not sure whether I requested access at that time to restricted documents, but this is actually a topic I'd like to get back to a little later, is because I had the opportunity to do quite a bit of research in the church archives in my adult life. And
all right, you worked on the Joseph Smith papers.
I worked on the Joseph Smith papers. Before that, I spent a few years doing research for Brian Hales on Joseph Smith's polygamy. Well, not a few years, a year and a half or so. And then I also have a number of projects of my own that I had worked on. But back to your question about my spiritual experiences as a teenager.
So you're doing research on the Adam God theory.
Right, and I'd encountered fundamentalist ideas on blacks in the priesthood.
Right, so just so we're clear, if anybody doesn't know, when you say fundamentalist, we're talking about polygamist groups.
Right, exactly. And I read some of their things on blacks in the priesthood, among other things, and I really didn't know what to make of it, because it sounded like early church leaders had taught that, blacks wouldn't get the priesthood till like the resurrection or something, and then there was the 1978 revelation that had happened, during my lifetime. And one time when I came home from school, I just had, strange as it may sound, I had an impulse to write a letter to the president of the church about the subject. And so...
of Adam God or blacks in the priesthood?
Blacks in the priesthood.
Okay.
It was President Benson at the time. And as I did, I experienced what Joseph Smith described as pure intelligence flowing into you. That's how he described what it feels like to receive revelation.
While you were writing the letter.
While I was writing it. So I ended up never sending it, because my questions were answered while I was writing the letter, rather than needing to write and ask. And I felt the Spirit so strongly at that point. Well, it lingered for a few days. It was so powerful. And a couple days later, one day I was returning from the church archives. I was going to catch a bus up to where we lived at the top of the avenues. And I was about to step off the curb onto a crosswalk. It was a crosswalk that had no light. You just step out and the cars are supposed to stop. And they always had before. But I had a thought or a voice tell me, don't go out in front of that car. There's a particular car that had just rounded the intersection onto the street. And so I listened to the voice, but I kind of didn't make a whole lot of it. I walked out into the edge of the first lane and then waited. And when the car passed in front of me, I saw that both the driver and the passenger, front seat passenger, were looking. They were like scrambling to get something off the floor or something. They were looking anywhere but at the road. The driver looked up at the road just after he would have hit me. And so, it's probably the most analyzed experience of my life, because at different times I've tried to figure out, I went through a period where I didn't believe, and so I had thought that there was another way to explain this experience, that somehow I could have subconsciously perceived, something. Mm-hmm. But as I'll get back to that.
Okay. So you're having these spiritual experiences as a teenager. You're doing research on esoteric church doctrines and right. history. How did your spiritual progression or your experience in the church evolve from there?
It was also as a teenager that I first experienced doubts. They started in an unusual way, family home evening. So it wasn't anything that was said in family home evening. It was, as a family activity, we went to the mall, to Deseret Book, and my dad gave us each money to buy a church-related book if we wanted to. And I found one in the general authority section by B.H. Roberts, who, as you know, had been a 70s, one of the 7 presidents of the 70s, and had edited like the history of the church and written a number of doctrinal works. There was even though he had passed away several decades earlier, there was a new book, a newly published book by him called Studies of the Book of Mormon. And how that ended up in Deseret Book, I don't know, but it didn't belong there. It was published, I think, by the University of Illinois, not really sure. But
why do you say it didn't belong there?
Because B.H. Roberts, early in the 20th century, he encountered some difficult questions regarding the Book of Mormon from a non-member. He gave the best answers that he could, but he felt like those answers really weren't adequate. And so he set about trying to sort of anticipate what were the strongest challenges that could be raised against the Book of Mormon.
So he started actually trying to come up with arguments against the Book of Mormon himself.
Yes, he did. So for the purpose of then anticipating criticisms and questions, he then, the next step, of course, would have been to try to come up with the answers.
Right, sort of an apologetic exercise where you're saying, what are the critics going to say, and then what are the answers to that?
Right. So all he really got through was, what are the critics going to say? So
you have this big list of arguments against the Book of Mormon from a church authority.
Right. So yes. So here was a general authority who had written a book of criticisms of the Book of Mormon. And he had never intended for it to be published, hence it hadn't been published in his lifetime. Now it was published. It was there. It ended up in the general authority section at Deseret Book because apparently whoever was ordering the books didn't realize what this book was. So it looked fascinating. I took it home. I started to read. Up until that time, I was 17. Up until that time, I had no more doubted the existence of Nephi than I had of George Washington. I'd grown up with the Book of Mormon, and I'd had spiritual experiences with the Book of Mormon, especially in trying to live its teachings in my own life. And I as I have later learned from responses that have been made to Roberts's manuscript by Jack Welch and others, his arguments really, by the time that they were published, were well out of date. But I didn't know that, and they seemed
like good arguments.
Yeah. And if this had been, Gerald and Sandra Tanner or Ed Decker or some other, noted anti-Mormon making these arguments, I would have had my guard up, But this one came in kind of under the radar, and so I experienced some really strong doubts for a period of months. And
so, did it occur to you that this was a believing member of the church and that he still believed in the church, or did I guess some people have wondered whether B.H. Roberts lost his testimony.
Well,
what was your impression?
So the person who edited the volume was Brigham Madsen, and he had lost his faith personally, and he argued in the introduction that B.H. Roberts had lost his faith. So that's how it was framed for me as a 17-year-old reading it, was that Roberts had started out doing this sort of devil's advocate exercise, but Madsen argued he really had ended up losing his faith.
Right. And you later came to find out what?
Later, this is something that I sorted out a long time ago, and I don't remember all the details, but I definitely think from the available evidence that I have seen in the past that B.H. Roberts continued to believe fully in the Book of Mormon and the Restoration as a whole. But at the time, I had been given the impression that B.H. Roberts had lost his faith and that this was an expression of that.
Yeah, that he's exploring intellectually the Book of Mormon, and as a result of doing so, loses his faith.
Right. And so it really challenged my faith. It raised the question whether the Book of Mormon was true, and if the Book of Mormon maybe wasn't true, then had Christ been resurrected? Was there a God? Was there life after death? It created a lot of anxiety for me, and I continued. I wrestled with things. I continued wrestling with them. I didn't give up, and I tried to live my faith. And with time, most of the issues seemed to that Roberts had raised. It's not like I had answers for all of them, but they kind of receded to the back of my mind. They didn't seem like barriers, insurmountable barriers to it being true.
Well, so I assume there were some that you read that you were able to figure out pretty quickly, and then others that lingered.
Yeah. So some of them, and again, this isn't something that I remember in detail, but some of the issues, I know he raised questions like about whether there might have been 19th century elements in the Book of Mormon. He looked at certain phraseology, he looked at certain ideas, and argued that this could have come from this revivalistic context, and this other thing could have been based on a certain New Testament story, things like that. In my mind, I kind of developed something. I developed the idea that although Joseph Smith was the Book of Mormon's translator, it was kind of filtered through his mind, and so.
Well, it's 19th century English, right? And so in some sense, he's got to use, a 19th century understanding of the world to explain what he is trying to translate.
Right. He doesn't have another way of communicating other than
with the words he uses.
Right.
And so it sounds like that, there are things that were still bothering you about issues that B.H. Roberts raised, but that I guess there were other elements of the church that helped you to feel confidence in the church, enough to feel, that the church is still, God's church, even though you had, some of these lingering doubts that B.H. Roberts helped raise.
Right. I saw, when it came to the Book of Mormon, as I looked into other things, I saw a mix of evidence. It seemed like there was evidence going in multiple directions. And I had my own spiritual experiences that I relied on.
Mm-hmm. And it was the spiritual experience that helped you to resolve concerns you had about the blacks in the priesthood and the history in that regard. It wasn't so much historical evidence or the things that you read from church leaders. It was more a personal experience where you felt like that this is okay.
Right.
Okay. And you went on a mission then after that?
I went on a mission to Houston, Texas. So I was in the Bible Belt and encountered a lot of evangelical Christians, mostly Southern Baptists. And, there was a good deal of opposition. The God makers had been shown a lot in churches in the area. And so, I got hit with you believe in another God and another Jesus.
So were there any experiences you had on your mission that that challenged your testimony?
There weren't experiences that challenged my testimony on my mission, but one thing that I discovered, I don't think I realized it was happening at the time, but shortly after I got home from my mission, I realized that my thinking had broadened. I'd become more open-minded and a better critical thinker. Now, that's not usually a benefit of a mission that you hear about, right? But that had been my experience. I was exposed to people of various religions, and hearing their ideas, it made me think. So it didn't make me doubt, but it sort of broadened my awareness and my perspective.
You exercise your critical thinking skills.
Yeah.
So when you returned from your mission, what did you get involved in then with respect to the church?
So I continued research that I had started before my mission. I did a lot of research on the Book of Mormon. I spent a lot of time, again, at the church library and archives. I studied Joseph Smith and polygamy. I studied the historical context of a number of the revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants.
So what's the purpose of all this study? Were you planning on becoming a church historian, or is this just a hobby for you?
It started as a hobby, and then it became more of a career path. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do with it at first, but I was just so drawn to studying church history, especially Joseph Smith. All things Joseph Smith are my area. I majored in history at BYU, and then I ended up, instead of going to graduate school anytime soon after that, I ended up working as a writer and editor professionally, and then doing my Mormon history research on the side. I intended to write some articles and eventually books, and I intended to go on for graduate degrees, which I've just done within the last few years. The main thing that I have tried to do over time really has not been so much to take a certain topic, dig in it some, and write something up and get it published. I've only recently started really publishing. The main thing that drove me was trying to dig to the bottom of things.
You had to figure it out.
Oh yeah, and for various reasons, and part of it, some of it had to do with faith, both the fact that I had faith, and so this was sacred history to me, so I wanted to understand it better and learn from it. Joseph Smith, if you look at his sort of prophetic corpus, the number of texts that he put out as a prophet that he revealed, and you compare that to what we have from any other prophet, in history, it just dwarfs all the others. And so if there was anybody who knew how to receive revelation, it was Joseph Smith. And so I wanted to learn from him about that and other things by studying him. Also with time, some faith issues started to, after my mission, my testimony was really quite strong. I did have some things in the back of my mind, things that had been raised when I was a teenager, but mostly I felt like I had dealt with those. But as I did more research, some new things started to pop up. And so I wanted to answer some of those faith questions for myself. So that was another motivation. And I wanted to contribute to other people's understanding, ultimately, by publishing. I also just have been perfectly fascinated with figuring out the past. I like to tell people that history is like detective work, except all your witnesses are dead, and you have to piece together from the clues they left behind what happened. And so that really that detective work angle that really has driven me.
Okay. And so as you engaged in this detective work, what did you find?
I found a whole spread of things. I mean, I found, I've got a number of projects that are now lined up to, for me to finish and submit for publication. Usually when we read church history, it's been sort of brought together, compiled for us by someone else, and sort of intellectually digested by them, and then, they give us what they've come up with from it.
Well, I mean, there's so many facts out there, and when somebody's reviewing all of these, they're picking certain of those facts to present to you.
Sure.
And there's usually some kind of, it's purpose driven. There's usually a message or some kind of an idea that they're trying to communicate as they pull together certain facts. But then you don't see necessarily all of the facts, not just because there's not room in one book for this person to give you everything he's looked at and in the libraries and that he's gone through, but also because all of the facts aren't there. Nobody has access to them all, and so history becomes filtered.
Yeah. So there's always a selection process. There's obviously no one book could fit all the data that we have,
and
close.
And we don't have all of the data.
Right. So there's a selection process, and then there's the author's interpretation of the selected data. And so when you're doing original research, you don't have the luxury of someone else having selected and interpreted data for you. You have to be the one to interpret it yourself.
Well, it's interesting, though, too. I mean, if you're going back to a journal, for example, we may consider that an original document or source document, doing primary research. But even the journal itself is an interpretation of events.
Oh, right.
And so somebody who's relating, well, so-and-so said this, or I did this, they're interpreting things as they're communicating them, and they're relying on their memory of events.
Right.
Which if you go back and think about the things you've written in your journal and you ask yourself, is that really how it happened? You might start to think, I don't know how much I can rely on somebody else's journal if in my own journal I'm not really sure I'm getting all of the facts straight.
Yeah.
So I think you have a really difficult job as a historian. We think of historians as telling us the truth, and setting forth what actually happened. And, as you think about the process and what goes into that, you become a lot less confident that, you're really able to reconstruct exactly what happened. You're, at best, able to approximate it.
Right.
You think that's fair to say?
Yeah. I think that scholarly progress is the process of getting at increasingly close approximations to what happened, and increasingly more complete explanations, meaning that they account for more and more of the data. Not that they're ever really complete, because they can't be. Well, to have something that was truly complete, wouldn't even work just to have like a full video of everything that was going on back then, because you'd also need to get inside the people's heads in order to understand their motives, because those are part of, in any story, motive is part of the story.
Mm-hmm. And then, two different people looking at the same picture may interpret what's going on in that picture differently and explain different things about it.
Yeah. So in doing my own research, I was encountering a lot of new things. I did my own personal research, for instance, on Joseph Smith and polygamy. I did quite a bit of research on D&C 132, the Revelation on Marriage. There are some obscure references there where it says, for instance, that Joseph had been commanded to make an offer to Emma, but it doesn't say what it was. And that's because D&C 132 is not a description of the events that were occurring at the time in Joseph and Emma's relationship. it's a part of what was occurring at the time. And so, Joseph and Emma knew the context. They knew what was being referred to, but we have to infer it from the evidence in the text and from the context. And so I did a lot of research on that. I started my Kinderhook plates research. I did a lot of different things with the Book of Mormon and so on. And some of the things that I found didn't fit the way that I had previously seen things. And so they raised questions in my mind about, they raised doubts, and increasingly over time. And, the questions that we ask really greatly shape the answers that we receive. Not even just in respect to spiritual things, like what we ask God, but questions that we ask as we search for truth. And the questions that I was asking, really, at this point, they became more and more focused on intellectual matters, and I relied less and less on spiritual things. And so I like to look at it as kind of like every domain of truth has its own toolkit, has its own toolbox. And so, if you're a mathematician, your primary tool is an equation or maybe a proof, In philosophy, you will have certain kinds of proofs that will be used that maybe are different from what you'd have in math or maybe partly overlap. In the biological sciences, you'll have some degree to do, some ability to do experiments, and you'll have direct observation and so on. With some sciences are historical sciences, like cosmology, looking at the early universe. We can't directly observe that, and so cosmologists then need different methods for figuring out what happened than what a biologist would use, or certainly than what a philosopher would use. So in the domain of religion and spirituality, there are appropriate tools for finding truth. I, though, came increasingly to mistrust those tools. I realized that there are people in a lot of different faiths who believe a lot of different things and who sometimes report religious experiences within their own faith that they understand to confirm that faith. And so realizing that, I became less certain about my own religious experiences. I thought, well, maybe they were just from me, from my own mind. And, it seemed like sometimes a trickier thing than I would have expected to interpret spiritual experiences. So, it's a different thing. It's one thing to receive personal revelation, and it's another thing to interpret and understand it correctly. And, now I'm retrojecting here thoughts that I have now back to this time period. But, there's no simple way to obtain wisdom. Wisdom is something that requires a great deal of maturity and reflection and depth on our part. And so I think that now that learning to deal with spiritual things is less like doing math equations and more like acquiring life wisdom. It's a process that requires much more from us in order for it to work. And sometimes we deal with uncertainties, and sometimes we only understand our religious experiences over time. But at this point in my life, the thoughts that I'm explaining now about the different toolboxes and this analogy with wisdom were not things that had occurred to me. So what I saw was that I could do some really cool things with my intellect, with scholarly methodologies, and applying those to Mormon history and scripture.
You're coming to value the tools of intellectual inquiry more than the tools of, spiritual insight or revelation.
Yes. I felt more comfortable using the intellectual tools because I felt I was really gaining some skill with them, and so I had more confidence with them.
And I mean, is it safe to say too that that's what you were practicing? You were practicing using those tools, and as you practice using those tools, you feel, more confident, and you feel that those tools are more reliable. Those are the tools you tend to go to.
Right.
As you're exploring truth.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a saying that I like that I think captures my experience really well. It's, to a man with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And, my scholarly methodologies were my hammer. It was a good hammer. And so even when I was looking for religious truth, I was increasingly relying on, those methodologies and what I could figure out, what I could hammer out intellectually.
Mm-hmm. And so how was that affecting your testimony?
Negatively. Because I took less seriously, placed less reliance on my spiritual experiences, I was left just with kind of a mixed bag of intellectual evidence, and increasingly with things that didn't fit into the paradigm that I had started with. And so there was kind of a cumulative weight over time that is like an increasing load was being put on my faith, and without the support of really relying on and pursuing further spiritual experiences, my faith couldn't sustain that kind of load. I had found some things that I thought were pretty compelling evidences for Joseph Smith being a prophet, but some of those...
And these are historical evidences.
Historical evidences.
Things in documents.
Right, so like the testimony of the 8 witnesses. Then in that instance...
So you're not really exploring so much the spiritual insights that you had, it had come to you earlier. Now you're turning almost entirely to looking at documents and
right. And there was an irony, and that was that my faith in a religion that's based on revelation was not really grounded anymore in revelation. It was grounded in intellectual evidence.
Right, not grounded in personal revelation.
Right.
And so in order to explore the truth, you're just using that one tool.
Right.
And you're letting these other tools, the strength that you may gain from exercising, using those other tools is starting to atrophy. Your spiritual muscles are atrophying.
Yeah.
Okay. During this time period, were you still praying? Were you still reading scriptures? I mean, were you doing some of it? Were you going to the temple? those kinds of things we think of as helping to strengthen us spiritually, were those a part of your life?
They were, but not to the extent that they really should have been. I think.
Were you feeling a connection with God during this period? So if you were going to church, or you're saying your prayers, reading your scriptures, had it become, if you were doing it at all, was it more of a routine, or were you still able to feel a connection with God in those activities?
It was a really complex process, and sometimes it was kind of back and forth. I didn't lose my faith all at once, nor was it linear. Sometimes my faith would ebb, and then I would sort of get some of it back. So there were times in there when I felt more connected with God, and times when I felt less connected. Again, in retrospect, things look different now than they did then, and I would say that, I wasn't following what would be the advice that I would give now to people who were in my same position that I was in then, which I can get to later.
I guess that, as you think about how, your testimony is starting to, wither or recede, or, one of the questions I think people will have, Orthodox members, people who haven't experienced this a lot, are you still going to church? You're still doing those things that we say in church you need to be doing. Are you you're doing drugs? Getting involved in things that are going to drive the Spirit away.
Sure. Okay. So throughout this, I continued active. I only stopped going to church well into my loss of faith when I. Several years in. So I continued to be active in the church. I was living a pretty decent life. It wasn't my ideal life spiritually, where I was. But I wasn't, my ebbing faith at the time was not certainly my level of spirituality at the time was a factor in that. If I had pursued my spiritual life more strongly, then that would have been a great help to me.
Okay, so as you're
but it wasn't the reason why I was having doubts wasn't the stereotyped things of that I didn't want to believe, or that I wanted to sin, or something like that. I was still intending to. I was staying in the church. I was intending to stay in the church, and I was living by basic LDS standards.
Okay, so let me see if I can state that in different words, and you tell me if I'm correct. That as you are doing your historical research, you're encountering things that are sometimes challenging, difficult to understand or explain based on what you had understood about the church and what you'd understood about doctrine. And you feel that you may have been able to digest those things easier with respect to, or that your encountering those things would not have deflated your testimony so much if, as you encountered those things, you also would have felt spiritual strength as you came to them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be accurate. Now, one thing that I think might be helpful for members of the church who haven't gone through a kind of faith crisis to understand is that sometimes if you see that someone is doubting, or they're not believing, and they're not fully living, maybe not fully living LDS standards, or maybe just not being as valiant as they could be, when someone doubts or thinks that thinks that the church isn't true, then their reason for living those standards disappears. So for instance,
sometimes they correlate, but it's hard to tell which causes the other, right?
Yeah, well, I think it can go both directions because cognitive dissonance comes into play. And so if they're living in a way that's not in accordance with the standards, then the psychological theory of cognitive dissonance would say that they will tend to either bring their behavior into line with the standard, or they'll tend to bring the standard into line with their behavior. Certainly that happens. It also happens the other way, where if somebody has, been, let's say, keeping the word of wisdom and all the standards of the church faithfully, but then they go through a huge crisis of faith, they start believing that it's not true, then suddenly the question occurs, well, why shouldn't I drink coffee?
Right.
If I don't think that God really said don't drink coffee, then the person, will not have a reason to not live the standard. And so sometimes I think there's a tendency to judge and to think that if someone is doubting or not believing, then it's because of, personal sin or whatever. Well, even if that were the case, it seems kind of more like a judgment for God to make than for us to make. But it's also jumping the gun unless you can really get inside the person's head. When I went through my doubt and ultimately disbelief, I felt extremely conflicted because I really wanted the church to be true. I had very meaningful experiences, although at this point I didn't, the spiritual experiences, I was interpreting them differently. I was thinking they came from me and not from God, so I wasn't placing the same sort of weight on them, But I wanted it to be true.
Why?
Why? Because I wanted there to be an ultimate meaning to life. Because I wanted the beautiful teachings to be true about God being our Heavenly Father and us having the capacity to become like Him and that being our destiny. I wanted there to be an afterlife. I wanted there to be a physical afterlife where we get these bodies back. I wanted there to be eternal marriage and eternal families. And, I had many, many reasons to want it to be true. But with the tools that I was relying on, they weren't getting me there to that conclusion. I dealt with a mixed bag of evidence. I ended up finding a lot of evidence that I didn't know how to handle, like I said, and I ended up, ultimately, I had these few sort of pillars of my faith. There were things like the experience of the 8 witnesses, like I mentioned, some others also, things like that. And what happened is that within a fairly short period of time, all of those evidences collapsed for me for different reasons. So, for instance, the testimony of the 8 witnesses is so impressive because it's not talking about angels or the kinds of things that one experiences in a vision. It's very matter of fact. It's very physical. It's like, hey, this guy Joseph Smith had these plates. He let us see them and handle them. We turned the pages. It's this is what they were describing. Well, I read something at that point by Dan Vogel on the testimonies of the witnesses that argued that the 8 witnesses' experience was actually visionary and that Joseph Smith just let them handle the plates through a cloth. I now would, for historical reasons, I would argue very strongly against the 8 witnesses seeing the plates being a visionary thing rather than a physical thing. But at that point, reading Dan Vogel's arguments, they seemed compelling enough. They seemed to offer a fairly good naturalistic explanation, and I thought, well, if I have a naturalistic explanation, then I don't need a supernatural explanation. And so this sort of thing happened with, like I said, a few evidences that were sort of the pillars holding up my remaining faith. So they collapsed, and so did my faith. I stopped believing. I still believed in God, but I didn't know, and I wrestled a lot. I went back and forth. I lost my faith, and then there was a time a little later when I, kind of got it back, and then it slipped away again. It was, like I said, it wasn't a very even process. There was a lot of back and forth, a lot of wrestling and struggling.
So what was happening is you were coming across, a number of different things that were causing you to think, well, how do I explain that, and what's going on there, and as you're doing that, I guess your testimony is deflating over time. Is that a fair representation?
Yeah.
And so what there wasn't really any one thing, I guess, that you can point to?
There wasn't any one thing, no.
And so was there a point where you said, okay, that's it, I'm leaving?
Yeah, there was.
Or was it a matter of you just recognizing, I've already left?
Well, it was, maybe some of each. So I stopped, I eventually did stop believing in God. So at first, when I stopped believing in the church, I still, like I said, believed in God. I eventually became an agnostic. I just wasn't sure there was enough reason.
That seems somewhat typical of members of the church who leave, as opposed to the Baptist who decides to start going to the Lutheran church or something.
Yeah.
Members of the LDS church tend to become agnostic or atheist if they leave. Why do you think that is?
It's a really good question, and I think you're exactly right that that's what tends to happen, and with some exceptions, of course. For me, when I stopped believing in the Restoration, it was hard for me to sustain much belief in the Bible after that, because I don't know completely. I think because it seemed like if biblical faith was true, then something like Mormonism ought to be true. And if Mormonism wasn't true, then it didn't seem like the Bible could be. And it seemed like I could raise the same sorts of objections to believing in the Bible that I could to believing in the Restoration. And so I was still kind of maybe sort of nominally Christian, for a while. And then, I guess part of it too is that in the Restoration there's so much stronger, the doctrine seems so much more coherent and reasonable, Like in more traditional Christianity, you have this widespread idea that people who've never heard of Jesus are, all going to hell. And some Christians believe that, children are saved, and some of them believe that the children go to hell, and God chose that because he predestined them, and, have all these beliefs that to me would make God an absolute monster. And so, the LDS view, it just makes so much more sense that I think when you stop believing in what's, the very reasonable sort of LDS near universal salvation, then it's hard to go from that to believing in something that makes God out to be much less than a loving Heavenly Father.
Yeah, so the doctrines of the LDS Church from a, I guess, intellectual standpoint or a rational basis seem to make more sense. To members of the church, I often look at our doctrines and say, this seems right. This this feels good. This is something that I can live with if this is the way the universe is constructed. And then if they don't believe that it's constructed in that way, it's a lot harder to accept the construction of the universe they find outside of Mormonism.
Right.
Yeah, that's my sense as well. And so you kind of, as you're moving away from Mormonism, you still have this sense that God's there, and then you even move out of that realm. As I guess you're still going through this process of studying historical documents and research.
I had never stopped my church history research. I'd continued that. I didn't have, the reasons weren't all the same. It no longer was sacred history to me, but it was kind of psychologically meaningful to me because I'd really been shaped by being a Latter-day Saint. I was culturally still Mormon and just completely fascinated, like I said, with these historical questions.
Well, as you explored those historical questions and had lost faith in God and faith in the restoration, did that affect the way in which you approached the historical documents?
Yes, definitely. So first let me mention, I became an agnostic, then I became an atheist. And that was due in part to the problem of evil and suffering, particularly the sufferings of children. I just couldn't see how to square the fact that some children seem to suffer pointlessly with the loving God, And I felt for a while like, in a way, it was a kind of principled stance, because I felt like if I couldn't come up with an explanation, then it would be wrong of me to kind of just...
to think this is okay.
To think it was okay, unless I could really see a good reason that would make it okay.
Right, and if you can't think of one, then there must not be a God.
Basically, I felt like I shouldn't just go on the idea that, well, I can't see how there could be an explanation, but I'll assume that there is. It just seemed like these were matters of such huge moral consequence that what I was telling myself at the time was that was a cop-out. And that is something that I look at differently now, of course. But I saw some instances of suffering kind of up close, and that really helped to cement my atheism. So having then become an atheist, and even having been at this point influenced by people like Sam Harris and his book The End of Faith,
So you were even reading atheist arguments by this point.
Oh, yeah. And see, I had been reading a broad spectrum of things for quite some time. I had read things from all different vantage points. I'd been very open, open-minded. What happened at this point was actually an exception to that, because, although I would have considered myself at this point still very open-minded, I basically stopped reading things that took a religious point of view. I was really only reading the non-religious, non-believing point of view, and I was really tired in my spiritual struggles, and I felt like I felt like I knew from the fact of suffering in the world, the types of suffering, and from my research that the church wasn't true and there wasn't a God. And so I thought to myself at the time that I should just close the book on all that. I should give up, because even though I hadn't believed for a while at this point, I'd still been struggling with it. I'd been wrestling, and it was not fun, and so it wasn't pleasant. And so I told myself I just needed to give up that struggle, and I just needed to accept reality, which reality for me was that there was no God, there was no ultimate meaning to things, and when we died, that was it. And so I started, like I said, just reading the non-believing point of view. So actually I became less open. My range of vision narrowed quite a bit, and what I was willing to consider narrowed quite a bit.
When you say what you're willing to consider, so in your interpretation of historical documents, what you're willing to consider is narrow.
I meant in general, but also, certainly it affected my approach to Mormon history. I was very disenchanted with religion, and I had been disturbed by some things that I'd found, and so I developed a model for understanding Joseph Smith that was the model of Joseph Smith as fraud, and or opportunist, basically. I started, as I mentioned earlier, it seems like the questions that we ask really shape the answers that we get. And the question that I was relentlessly asking in my research was basically like, what's in it for him? Like I would look at everything that came out of Joseph Smith's mouth, and I would ask this question: how could this have benefited him?
Yeah, so
I was assuming that it was all selfish, right? Self-interested behavior.
Explain Joseph Smith's actions on the basis of what's he going to get.
Right, and and it wasn't. And what I was doing was certainly more sophisticated than that, because I was also applying some good methodologies, looking carefully at the context in which he said things, trying to relate what he was saying to that context, that's good methodology. But I was basically assuming that his motives were just to benefit himself. So I was assuming he was narcissistic.
Okay. And did you feel like that was a fruitful paradigm as you approached the analysis of these documents?
For a while I did. And part of that is because I was not only asking that question, but I was asking that question in the context of carefully exploring the relationships between what Joseph Smith was saying and the context in which it was said. And so I was certainly seeing connections there. And
you were finding evidence to support what you were assuming to be true?
Well, partly I was seeing connections that just helped to make more sense of what was going on. Like, why would a certain revelation be dictated at this point? Well, if you look at the circumstances, it makes sense because of what's going on here. But then specifically, I was assuming that within the context of those circumstances, Joseph Smith was just acting out of his self-interest. And you can apply that sort of paradigm, and you can say, okay, well, polygamy was about sex, and
tithing's about money. He's so many of these other things. Priesthood's about power,
right? And
domination.
Basically, money, sex, and power were the things that I was assuming. Since I was assuming he was self-interested, as were what I was assuming he was after. For a while, that seemed to make sense. The more that I dug and tried to understand the relationship between what Joseph Smith was saying and the context in which he was saying and the audience to whom he was saying it, the more I tried to understand the details, why would he have said this or done this, it started to seem like I could actually explain less and less. It seemed like the paradigm, the model, was not adequate for the job that I was using it for.
So you couldn't explain everything in terms of money, sex, and power.
Yeah, right. So the first breakthrough was just, it seemed like, and I guess it is a really simple thing, I started seeing evidence that Joseph Smith really cared about his family. I started, remembering things that Joseph Smith had done and said that seemed to be to benefit his parents, for instance. I thought about, so I'd been assuming, like I said, Joseph Smith was a narcissist, and so he only really cared about himself. Then I thought about in Carthage jail, when Hiram was shot, and Joseph cried out, "Oh, Hiram, my brother, what have they done to you?" And, he wasn't acting. I mean, nobody under those circumstances is going to be acting, right? When there are people right outside the door and outside the window with guns shooting at you. This was just genuine love and concern for his brother. And as I looked, I think that was the first one that clicked in my head, and then as I looked, again, I changed the question that I was asking, right? I changed it to the question of how could what Joseph Smith was saying and doing have benefited his family? And I started seeing, okay, wait, so that actually would explain a lot more if he's not just concerned for himself, but he's also concerned for his family members. With time, I've been able to, I've expanded the questions that I ask, and I can see where Joseph Smith was doing things for others, and certainly where he was doing things for God, where he was doing things out of deep, sincere religious motives.
Thank you for listening to the Mormon Faircast. If there is an issue that you've been wondering about, you can often find the latest answers at the Fair Wiki, found at fairmormon.org. If you can't find your answer there, feel free to pose your question to the Fair apologists by visiting the Fair contact page. Questions or comments about this episode can be sent to podcast@fairlds.org or join the conversation at fairblog.org. Tell your friends about us and help increase the popularity of this podcast by subscribing in iTunes and by writing a review. Music for this episode was provided courtesy of Paul Cardall. The opinions expressed in this podcast are not necessarily the views of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or of Fair.